Hi, in this video we demonstrate how to use services to expose applications in a Kubernetes cluster. First, we will start with a simple pod. So the kubectl run command allows me to not only run a pod with a specified image, but also to expose it. So basically it creates a pod and a service with one simple command. Now, to validate that the service has been created together with the pod and the endpoint resource of the service, we will run the kubectl get pod services and endpoints command, but pods, services, and endpoints are listed in their abbreviated format, PO, SVC, and EP. But I wanted to show the labels of these resources as well, just to make sure that the selector of my service is actually set to the label of the pod. So how can I validate that? Well, I run kubectl describe service, and I can grep for the value of the selector, and it seems that the value of the selector is run pod hello, which matches the label of my pod. Now, this will ensure that the endpoint will inherit the IP address of the hello pod. Now, how can I validate this? I run a describe pod command, but this time I will grep for the pod IP. And in the pod definition, the pod IP is 10.244.205.198, which matches the endpoint IP address. So we know that all of these resources match. Now, let's take advantage of the Minikube service built-in command to list the available service in my cluster. Since my service, the pod hello service, is a ClusterIP type service or internal service only, it is not exposed outside the cluster, so Minikube does not provide us with a URL to access it from outside the cluster. So if we need to validate that the service works, we need to log in to one of the nodes. We need to be somewhere inside the Minikube cluster. So we will run the Minikube SSH command, which opens a terminal on the control plane node. And then from here, I will run curl. But first, I want to validate that I can get a response from the pod itself. Okay? So I'm selecting the IP address of the pod, run curl against it. I could repeat it a few times, and every time I run the curl, I'll get the response from the pod. Okay? You see that the response always includes the pod name and the IP address of the pod. Now, what about the service? The service should provide the same response. So now I'm looking at my service IP address, 10.110, and I'm going to run curl against the service's IP address. And it seems that every request sent to the service will actually provide a response from the same pod consistently. Okay? So this tells me that my service is sending my requests through to its endpoint pod. Now, this is only accessible from within the cluster. How can I access my pod from outside the cluster? Well, by changing the service type to a NodePort service type. So that can be done with the kubectl edit service command. And what I would need to do here is to scroll down to that type field, and instead of ClusterIP, which is default internal, convert this to a NodePort. Keep in mind that NodePort, the value of NodePort is case sensitive. Save and exit. So we've just edited the live service. Now I want to list resources one more time to confirm that the service has been modified. No longer a ClusterIP type, but it is a NodePort type. And we see that it is listening outside of the cluster on port 31161. So how does this reflect in the Minikube service command? Well, it seems that Minikube has provided us with a URL to access this service. Okay. Now, ideally, this would work just by clicking on this link. But if it doesn't immediately work, okay, then what we would want to do is to ensure that we can right-click on it. And once we do that, the open link option should be clicked as well. And this should open a tab in our default browser with the response from the pod. Remember, this is the pod's IP address, but we are accessing the service from outside the cluster. Okay, so I can refresh this. It consistently provides the same response. Now, what about a more complex application? What if I want multiple replicas? What if I want a deployment to be exposed via a service? Then I would first create a deployment with a kubectl create deployment command. I'll be running the same hello from image, exposing port 80, and I'll be requesting for 3 replicas to be created. But a deployment cannot be exposed directly with the create command, so I need to run the kubectl expose command instead, and I am requesting for a NodePort type service to be created. Now again, we need to validate that our resources have been created and they have the correct labels and selectors. And this time I will use the deployments label app deploy hello as a selector to filter throughout all of my resources. So I only display the deployment, its 3 pods, the service, and the endpoint resource. And as we can see, we have 3 pods, 3 endpoint IP addresses. The label of the deployment is found on the pods as well. And then eventually the service will have the same selector. Now let's run the Minikube service all command. So this shows the new URL for the deploy hello application. Let's see if we open this link in the browser, if we can mimic that load balancing. So ideally, the service should randomly load balance between the 3 pods of the service. So if I hit refresh, this should alternate between the 3, but it seems that it doesn't, so there's some limitation when we're accessing the service, a NodePort service from a browser. But what we can do is run curl against this URL. So let's do just that. Curl, copy this URL, paste. So the first curl received a response from the pod ending with the IP address 199. Let's run this several times. Okay, so we see that randomly the service will send traffic to the endpoint with ending its IP in 199, then 72, 199, eventually 72, and then 5 again. So if we look at our endpoints, here's the one ending in 72, here's the one ending in .5, and then here's the one ending in 199. Okay. So in this demo, we've exposed a simple pod via a ClusterIP and a NodePort type service, and then a deployment via a NodePort type service. So this concludes this demo video. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you join me in the next one.